All right, is everybody ready? Can you all see my my screen here?
Yep.
All right. Okay, so this paper is called Unsupervised Object Discovery and Co-Localization by Deep Descriptor Transforming. So basically the idea of this paper is you want to do co-localization. So you have two images, you want to find the common image, or sorry, the common object in that image. And so they do it by an unsupervised method. They call their method deep descriptor transforming, or DDT. So their main contributions are like improvements. Basically, they generalize to unseen categories pretty well. They deal with noisy data, which actually they go through as a bit of a challenge for this co-localization problem. So basically you can use DDT to search for similar images to the ones that you have in order to augment your data. So, you know, if you have several images of a certain class, you can find new ones in an unsupervised manner. So the basic idea is to use a pre-trained model and then take the activations from the last couple of layers and use that to detect the common object in two images. So for instance, so in this diagram, you can see if you're looking for airplane. So this is an unsupervised thing, by the way. So basically it's looking at these images and it's just deciding, you know, is there an airplane in it? And then kind of finding the bounding box for it. So it looks through these. What's that? I'm trying to. Yeah, if you can scroll down. Can everybody see this diagram right here where there's airplanes? All right, so, okay. So if you go on the diagram on page 2 here, so we have these airplane images. You'll notice one is like not actually of an airplane. And so this is like one of the examples of the noisy data that they're able to reject. So when they use this DDT method, they'll basically feed that through a pre-trained model and use the activations to figure out where the airplane is in each of the images. And then if there is no airplane, they can reject it. Yeah, so if we go through their main contributions, so basically does not require any image labels, doesn't require negative images or like, you know, contrasting images. Generalized to unseen categories, rejects noisy data, and they also contribute a web data set. So basically they use it to search the web for similar images, and then they collect this new data set, which they name web BOC. And now, so I'll go a little bit into more of the details of the method. So actually, yeah, so I'll go through the details of the method and kind of like compare it with the previous work. So so the idea of their DDT method, it's based upon a method that the same lab or authors did previously, called SCDA. So that stands for selective convolutional descriptor aggregation. So basically this is another paper that they wrote previously, which takes one image and then finds the same type of idea, finds the similar image on the web. So if you basically have one image, you can find a bunch of different images that are of the same category. So, and it's fine grained. So for instance, it would be something really specific, like, oh, it's like a bluebird rather than just a bird. And then you take that and then find similar images on the web using SCDA. The main differences between their previous work and this one, so this one uses the whole image set rather than just taking one image. So basically they can look at many different images of, let's say an airplane, and use that as the, correlate that whole image set, and then use that to decide whether or not new images that haven't been seen before also contain, the airplane or whatever.
Hey, Adrian, are you using a microphone? There's just like a lot of noise for some reason. Is something moving?
A lot of noise?
Yeah. Is something moving around? Like, it seems like a wire hitting a microphone or something.
Maybe, hold on. All right, is that any better?
I think so, yeah.
It sounds better.
All right, cool. All right. So yeah, basically distinguishing their new method from their old method is that they use a whole image set rather than just one image. And then for this other method, weakly supervised object location. So this method actually is like partially supervised. So there is actually like image labels. You might have like a negative image, like basically an image that doesn't belong to that class, but they don't have that at all. So it's basically just one set of images, and then they can do this co-localization method.
So what's the weekly part?
So the weakly supervised, so that's a separate method from this one. So they're basically distinguishing it from previous work. So
I get that, but why is it called weekly? If you're,
I think,
yeah.
So I mean, I didn't read that previous paper, but from what I understand from what they described. So let's see if I can scroll to that section one. So yeah, so from what I understand is that their method in this paper requires some like manually labeled images, whereas this DDT method in this paper does not require that.
Okay, I understand that's the supervised part, but that doesn't explain the weekly. Like,
oh, the weekly part, yeah.
I think
yeah,
yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't read the previous paper. I'm only going off of, what their description of the paper. I'm assuming that weakly supervised in the sense that like not every image is labeled, like it's not fully supervised.
I'm assuming that it's supervised not with the bounding box, but it's just like triplets saying these two images contain the object, this other one does not. That's probably why they say it's weekly, but yeah, I haven't looked at the other paper either.
Okay.
I was hoping you would have.
No, I didn't read all the specific papers that they referenced.
This was the main one, so yeah, probably it's good to reference the main one.
Yeah, well, I mean, the main one that they do reference is actually their own previous paper, the SCDA one.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so a little bit about the actual method that they're using. So essentially what they do is they'll take one of the last layers in the convolutional in the last convolutional layers of the pre-trained model, and take those activations and go basically create a PCA. So basically they look for the first principal component of this of the convolutional layers from an image set, and then they use that to basically create a map of where the strongest activations are, and then they use that to basically resize that back into the main image, and then use that to localize where the object is. So basically, so here's what they call the deep descriptors, because basically DDT, deep descriptor transform. The deep descriptor is basically if you have let's say an image which is like H by W, so it's like a just one image. So then you have the convolutional layers are going to be some channel length, so channel depth, I guess, and then they're all going to be a smaller size, which is little h by w, and then the deep descriptor is basically going along that channel depth across each element in that matrix. So if you can imagine like the channels of the last convolutional layer, basically like, let's say a small like 7 by 7 box, and then it's very deep, so it has, let's say, hundreds of channels. And so one of the deep descriptors would be if you took 1 pixel of that across the entire depth. And so they do that for all the images in the set. And then they're going to do PCA on it so they can find the principal component of it. So basically now what they do for that is, so they call this principal components of each of these pixel locations. So they aggregate that into this indicator matrix. So basically the indicator matrix will basically correlate positively with similar objects. And so the locations where this is a positive value is going to be considered to be where that image or where that object is in the image. And then the negative ones, or let's say the zeros, they don't really correlate, or if they're negatively correlated or poorly correlated, then they're considered to be background or some other object. And then, so basically keep in mind this is like the size of the last convolutional layer. So they have to actually resize it. Where did they write that? There was, yes. So, so once they calculate this indicator matrix, they're actually resizing it back into the original image resolution. And then they collect the largest connected component, basically like the biggest section that's positively correlated. And then they would consider that to be the localization of that particular image. So let's see if I can get the diagram here. So for instance, on this one, these graphs are basically showing the value of that indicator matrix. So anything that's above 0 in this case is considered to be part of the airplane. So in this case, we have only a few sections of the image that are actually above 0. And then those are basically red. And then the rest that are either negatively correlated or close to 0 are considered to be outside. And so that's how they basically localize where the airplane is. And so right here, they're comparing their old method, SCDA, to the DDT. So the SCDA basically is it's only fed one image, and so it doesn't have like it basically it's not able to like generalize as well as the DDT method. So basically, it's you can see for here like it's finding a bunch of localizations that are outside of where it's supposed to be. Over here, it's actually predicting wrong objects. So this is supposed to look for a bicycle, and then it's finding basically a person and like a signpost. And so basically their advantage of the DDT is that you're using the whole image set, and you can figure out without actually feeding it negative examples, whether it's not, whether it belongs to the class or it belongs to a different class. So there's a bit of their results here. So, so the results, the way they evaluate all of these is basically by what they call the correct localization metric. So I guess it's similar to IOU, but basically they take any IOU that's like greater than 0.5 and they consider that to be correctly predicted. And then below that, they consider that to be not a correct prediction. So we go through some of the results they have. So there's a few data sets they work with. I think one of them is actually the Pascal. So basically, let me see if I can find where it is. Yeah, here we go. So yeah, so the object discovery data set, the Pascal 2007 and 2012 data sets, and then the ImageNet subsets data set. So the ImageNet subsets is actually like disjoint from ImageNet. So it contains classes that were not actually part of ImageNet. And so this is kind of what they use to show that they can generalize outside of unseen classes. So even though they use a pre-trained model on ImageNet, they can use the same method and generalize outside of the classes that are in ImageNet. So we'll see that in a little bit. So one thing that's also about another one of the data sets, so object discovery has noisy images. And so basically those do not have any, they don't contain any object that's in their category. And so they're also using this data set to show that DDT can identify these noisy images. So their object discovery, so these are their results. So the DDT plus, maybe I'll go over that later, but basically DDT plus is their method that instead of just using the first principal component, they also use the second one. And by kind of combining the information from both of those, they can get a more precise localization. But generally both the DDT and the DDT plus perform pretty well in localization. So it's basically whenever you get more than half of the bounding box in the correct spot, then you're considered to have a correct localization. And so they get 91.4 on airplane, 95 on car, and then the horse a little bit lower. But basically their mean score across the object discovery is basically the state of the art. So yeah, so unseen classes apart from ImageNet. So basically this is the ImageNet subsets. This contains new categories that are not in ImageNet. So chipmunk, rhino, raccoon, rake, wheelchair. So these results are down here. So these are all classes that the model has not seen before. So they're using a pre-trained model on the regular ImageNet, and these are basically new classes that it hasn't seen before, and it's still able to predict the bounding box fairly well. These were the I guess mistakes where basically the bounding box was not correctly predicted. So for instance, on rake, appears to be picking up some other triangular or rake-shaped object, but it's not correctly getting the rake. But overall, the performance is actually pretty good, considering that they have not seen these classes before. Let's see if I can find. So I'm going to go a little bit through the DDT plus method, if I can find it. So, okay, so yeah, the multiple layer ensemble. So so for DDT plus, they use this idea that so the layers of a network are so basically at the lower layers you're going to have edge detection and more kind of granular things that you're finding, and then at the highest layer you're predicting semantic information like, is this an airplane, is this a car, is this a boat? And so their idea is that if they take the last layer to identify the object in the image, and then they take the layer before that to get a little bit more precise with where this object is located. And the idea behind that is that they can localize it even better. So that's what they call DDT plus. So let me see if I can find their picture of DDT plus. So particularly on particularly on this bottle class, you can kind of see what happens here. So basically, they're using on this leftmost image, this is going to be the final layer, which is basically finding, okay, where are the bottles? And then this deeper layer is a bit more of like an edge detection, kind of shape detection maybe layer. And so it's finding other information, but it's also finding more precisely where the bottles are. So you can see that this is kind of just like a blob of all the bottles on this image. And then on this one, it's kind of getting a little bit more precise. It's finding, okay, where are the bottles in the image? And so they basically combine these two using the second one as like a mask for the first one. And so, obviously they don't care about the people in this image. They just want the bottles. So you would ignore that part because this image over here doesn't count those. But then over here, you kind of just mask over the blob of bottles on this one, and you end up with a more precise localization of where the bottles are in the image. And so, yeah, so you can see this for other classes. So for instance, the car. Again, see the car is kind of detecting stuff on the outer edges. They don't really care about that because the first layer, or sorry, the last layer is giving them the information of where the cars are. So now they can precisely locate where the car is. So let me go through a little bit more of the results. So their method for noisy images. So I'll go through some of the results on the noisy images. But their method for noisy images is basically to take their indicator matrix. So if they, let's say they have this indicator matrix of where the positive values are. So generally, if you get an image that's mostly 0 or mostly negative, then you can pretty much throw that one out because there's not enough positive activations. And so basically, if you don't have any positive activations, you can throw that one out as a noisy image. So to get a little bit more detailed, what they do is they'll take the detection score, which is the number of positive values in their indicator matrix, divided by the total amount of values in the matrix, right? So basically, if you have this indicator matrix up here, so this guy right here, if they find that there's only a very small fraction of these are positive, then they might also throw that out as a noisy image. And they ran some tests and they figured out that a good noisy image threshold to use, I believe, is 0.1. So basically, if less than 10% of these are positive, then they're going to try to throw that out as a noisy image. And so these are basically using different thresholds for a noisy image to see how well they can throw out the noisy data. Their method is the one in red, and there's a previous method from a different paper in blue. And so if they vary the threshold for a noisy image, you get this RLC curve of true positive versus false positive on each of those classes. And so this is an example of some of the noisy images that you might get. So these don't actually contain the objects that they're supposed to be predicting in the data set. And so this DDT method is supposed to recognize these as, they don't contain any object. And so they'll throw it out.
Hey, Adrian, I'm sorry, I didn't get how they're doing the ensembling. They're not actually like concatenating the vectors from the various layers. You said something about a mask. Can you just?
Yeah, no, they're not doing that. So let me go back to the image here. So they're not really concatenating. They're actually doing something pretty simple. So it's just like, so for instance, if you look at the leftmost image on this bottle, so that's from the last convolutional layer. And then the second image is from the second to last convolutional layer.
Yeah.
So they basically apply the same method for two different layers.
Got it. You just take the delta of the two, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. So they basically just use this more, shape detecting one in the second to last layer, and then basically take the difference between the two, and then you just grab only the sections of image one that also are in image two. So now you have this smaller, more precisely localized bottle here.
So you could do this for like n number of layers, like.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that I guess in practice they found that the last and the second to last work well. I don't see why you can't, for instance, use a different layer, like a even further behind layer or anything like that. Like you can ensemble multiple layers, not just the last two.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
cool.
so that's their way of detecting more precisely where the objects are. Okay. So Yeah, so those what they call Webley supervised data set. So they're basically pulling images off the web. And so when you search for car, you're going to get some of these noisy images that aren't necessarily of a car. They're just, maybe of a background or some part of a car. And so you want to reject these noisy images. And so their method is basically working on this web cars and web ImageNet data sets. And so they're using different thresholds. So threshold 0 for that noisy image is just like any image that has any positives, they consider to not be noisy. So even with that 0 threshold, they'd still do pretty well, actually. So about 70%. And then if they increase the threshold to 0.1, they found that works pretty much the best. And so they can get a better accuracy up to 78, 79. And then this is on Web ImageNet, another kind of web scraping data set. And so there's a difference between their threshold results on that data set as well. Okay, and there's some more results. So this one, so what they are trying to show here is a bit, so they're trying to show that their methods are trained on less data. So this data set for their DDT method, they're using 10,000 images across 20 categories. And this other COCO data set is 120K, which are actually human labeled, and there's 80 object categories. So DDT is basically just figuring out based on, okay, I have these 20 categories, and then it's automatically labeling a bunch of different images that it hasn't seen before, as long as they contain that object. So, and their results are actually pretty comparable to this much larger data set with more precise human labeled images. So here's their DDT on the Pascal VOC 2007 and VOC 2012 training data.
So because this one needs the covariance matrix and all that, right? Do they give any guidance on how many minimum images you need to get this sort of core image set correlation to work? Like they didn't plot that somewhere in the paper.
So like basically minimum images of like one class, you mean?
Yeah.
I don't know if they said specifically. Yeah, I mean, I think they're using, so I mean, yeah, I think they pretty much use the same training data from like Pascal VOC. I don't think they actually have like information on like what the minimum you might need to do that is.
Yeah, I can show Richard's results. He only used 50 images when you're done, and I'll show you what those look like.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that would be really nice, actually. So, let's see. Yeah, so this is basically their last bit of results here. It's results on these 20 different categories that DDT was trained on. And so they're, let's see, what else? Yeah, so this is a little bit more of that detail on how they got from, so P1 and P2 are these these layers from the very last the very last convolutional layer, and then the one before it. So let's see. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I'm mixing that up with another thing. So the further study here, they're basically looking at so instead of looking at the two layers, they're now looking at the two principal components. So basically, they're looking at first principal component of one set of images, and then the second principal component. So they're basically finding out that the second principal component actually starts separating the parts of the image. So they're saying like the head of the dog, or let's say the wheels of the airplane. So for this, in this case, right, so you have P1, which is finding the whole thing. So it's kind of more activated on the whole dog. And then P2 is more focused on the torso region, and then kind of cuts out the head. And then for the airplanes, you'll have something like this, where you have most of the airplane in one, the first principal component. And then a second principal component, you can see it's more activated on the wheels, and then less so on the fuselage and the other parts of the airplane. So they're suggesting that, like, in future work, essentially you can possibly use these principal components to find different parts of the image. But they don't go too much in detail on that. So they're basically saying that's like a future potential of DDT. Yeah, so that's about it. If you guys have any questions that you have, and also I think, we have somebody did a nice demonstration of DDT, so that would be nice to see what that would be. But yeah, so that's about it.
Yeah, so one thing they didn't cover is, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
One thing they didn't cover is, like, if I have a folder of images and I don't know what object classes I have in here, how do I segregate them before I can do this kind of co-localization? Do you have any intuition about that?
So I guess, can you be more specific about, like, segregating it? Like, you mean
Well, I
filtering?
don't want to just have, like, let's say I have a folder and there's like 5 different object classes in there, There are vases and glasses and cups and plates. And I want to localize all of those, but, not like just come up with one class out of the whole thing. I want to know that there's 4. I want to find the images that belong to each cluster, and then localize on these smaller segments.
So you're saying, like, let's say there's a picture that has, like three or, several objects in one image, or?
No, not in one image. No, that's a bridge too far. I wouldn't expect that to work. That's really, really hard.
Okay.
I'm just saying I have a collection of images. I have a single folder of images. And in there are multiple object classes. I have pictures of, cats and dogs and elephants, etc. I don't want it just to run through that folder and treat all the images and just say, here's elephant, and all of these other ones are not elephant. I want it to come out to what multiple classes. I want to know I have 50 elephant images, 50 cat images, and then co-localize within each subgroup.
Okay.
Anyway, so one approach I was thinking is, like, whether you have ImageNet 1000 classes for these or not, you just do some pre-processing, right? Like, you just do some prediction using ImageNet 1000, and then, group those, even if it's the wrong class. Hopefully it's, like, consistently the wrong class, right?
Yeah.
And then you run co-localization.
Yeah,
I don't know if you guys can think of better approaches.
I was thinking.
Sorry.
I was thinking this way, that since we have like good pre-trained models, pass these through, pass all these images through the model and get the embeddings, and then do like a PCA clustering or like a TSNE visualization, and you still won't have like a labeled clustering, but you can have cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3, and depending on what are the candidates that belong to each cluster, you can just segregate them to do the co-localization afterwards.
Do you need embedding and all this other stuff, PCA, TSNE? I mean, you can
Well,
take the
because if the
softmax
embeddings are
outputs and cluster those.
if the embeddings are like very high dimensions that you get, cursor dimensionality. So that's the reason I was thinking maybe, oh, even if the embeddings are 10 dimensions, that's fine. You can do the k-means straight away. But if it's like a 256 dimensions or like 512 dimensions or something, you need to bring it down a little bit so that you don't get hit with the cursor dimensionality. That's one vague approach. You still don't. You still can't do that. Okay, this cluster belongs to elephant, and before you investigate it yourself, you need a human in the loop. But that's, I think, one of the lowest hanging fruits to get to segregate these images in the huge folder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
So any more questions?
Can you talk a little bit about the image resizing? I'm a little bit.
Oh yeah. So I didn't go through the algorithm in too much detail, so I can go through that a little bit more detailed here. So so let's scroll up here. All right, so the basic idea is we start with where am I? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so we have an image, let's just say it's big H by big W, right? So it starts at some height and width. And then when you feed it through the neural net, you're going to get a smaller, smaller image, which is small H by small W, but, you're going to have a lot of channels. So it'd be like, maybe rather than just 3 RGB channels, you'll have whatever the amount of channels in the network that you chose. So they create this indicator matrix based off of the smaller H by W like convolutional layer. And then what they'll do is, let me get their particular wording here. Let's see. Yeah, so you get this indicator matrix first, which is up here. I mean, this is small h by small w, and this is the principal components across, one image class of, particular image class. They aggregate across there to get the indicator matrix, and then they'll resize it by using nearest neighbor interpolation into the image that you feed into the model. So if you fed in let's say this airplane image, so the indicator matrix is really smaller than the size of this actual box here. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. Yeah. So your indicator matrix is some small h by small w, right? It's a smaller size than this. And then what they're doing is they kind of blow it back up into the actual image size, and then they use the indicators across those. So if you can imagine this, when it's in the small size, the indicators would kind of be clustered towards this corner here, and then you would resize it, and then you'd see that the clusters cover this region of the actual image.